Hello, and welcome once again to Family Historian. My name is Stephen Conte. In the year 2022, the 1950 Federal Population Census was opened to researchers, and that will be tonight's topic. We're going to learn how to do mid-century genealogy. And joining me on tonight's show, I am very happy to have as my guest a good friend of mine. His name is Tom Riley. Tom is a professional historian. He is the town historian for Bloomingdale, New Jersey. He is also the author of 7 books, and he is the proud owner of a 1951 Chevy. And on tonight's show, Tom and I are going to teach you about the 1950s. And now let's talk with my fellow baby boomer, Tom Riley. Tom, welcome back again.
Happy to be here.
Great. You look so spiffy. We both look spiffy in our 1950s bowling shirts, which we are very happy to wear, okay? We were both boys in that era, in the 1950s. Now, Tom, let's define that era, those years. What years are we talking about, roughly, mid-century? Give us the first year and the last year. Around what years?
Well, baby boomers are considered from 1945 until the early 60s.
Right, so the end of World War II, because I was born, well, now you'll all know, I was born in 49, and so I'm a baby boomer. Okay, great. Now, the 1950 census opened up in 2022. What is the span when these census records open? How many years is that?
Every 72 years. So they figure that a person's lifetime is 72 years. Mm-hmm. So that's why they release them every 72 years.
Is that for privacy purposes? Or?
Probably. You know, they wonder how many people will still be alive at that time.
Right.
And you're releasing personal information. So
right.
It's probably privacy. Yes.
So now the 1960 census will open up in 2032.
Correct.
And we'll be around to see that.
Of course.
I hope. Okay, fine. Now we're going to show you an example of the 1950 census. The Federal Population Census records are really sculpted for the time. I know I was doing research in the 1940, and the big question there was, do you own a radio? I guess they saw the onset of war, but that was the big question, okay? But now let's look at the 1950 census, because I am on it. And it gives you a wealth of information. I think they get better and better as we go along. Okay. Now on this census, I see that my grandfather is here. I see my aunts and uncles are here and a few cousins. And of course, my father, who was the head of the family, his name was Guy Conte. It gives his age and his occupation. And there I see my mother, Flora. And this baby here, Stephen Gerald, I was 6 months old in 1950. So there I am on the 1950 census. And
first time.
I'm sorry, that's right. My debut on the 1950 census. Okay. Now, what I like about this one, if you look at the census, you will see that not only do you have the nuclear family, you know, father, mother, the traditional family, father, mother, child, but you will see the aunts and uncles and cousins. So you will get an extended family sometimes living in the same house. Have you seen this as well?
Yes, definitely.
You know, well, your aunts are there, your uncles are there, your cousins, your grandfather, and of course their occupations. Now, I see 3 of my relatives here. There's my Uncle Dante, who was not married, still living at home. My Aunt Lydia, not married, living at home. And by the way, my Aunt Lydia is still living. She's 101. Okay,
fantastic.
So she's been on many census records. And then there's my Aunt Valia, and she was unmarried. In those days, people lived at home until they got married. That was the moral way of living. Did you understand that as well in your own family?
Yes, and it's also a characteristic of the 50s, where the nuclear family today is more likely to be seen on the census.
Right.
Whereas in the 50s, the extended family was the common, the norm probably.
Right. So they sometimes lived in the same house.
Or next door.
Or next door, you see. So it makes genealogy very easy. Now, I hate to see what's going to be on the 1970, or not, I think I won't live to see that one, or the 1980, but you will see I guess I hate to use the word progression or digression of the family. You have more colorful families nowadays, you see. But this is sculpted for the period, the 1950 Federal Population Census. And I ran into a young lady who was doing research, and this is ancient for her. And she found her grandpa, who was working as a soda jerk, which was a very popular profession for young men years ago. And she was so enchanted by that. Now, you are on the census here, the Riley family, and where are we talking about with this family?
We're talking in Bloomingdale, New Jersey. And similar to yours, it has my father, Arnold, my mother, Emily, my oldest brother, Joel, my second brother, Donald, my sister, Joyce.
Yes.
And me, and I'm listed as 1-year-old.
Okay, you have a year on me almost, right.
And also, there is my grandfather who lived 2 houses away, and my uncle that lived next door.
Right.
So even though they weren't in the same household, as the census taker went down the street, they were all different family members that ended up on the census together.
Right, right.
My father had a saw sharpening shop. So he always listed his occupation as self-employed for some reason.
Yes.
So, again, this was my first census also. 1950 is the first time I show up there as well.
Right. So it's a very helpful census to the researcher.
Yes.
And it differs from the 1940.
Correct.
Right. So now we have the 1950, which was opened, as I said before, in the year 2022. So the younger generation of genealogists will be able to look at this. Great. Now, I know the 1950s was a pleasant era and a kind of a turbulent era as well. We did have the Korean War. So now we're going to get into some military records. The Korean War. And what years are we talking about with the Korean War?
Started for the United States in 1950, and it ended, or they came to an armistice. A ceasefire took place in 1953.
I see. All right.
So 50 to 53.
Right. And can you give us some background of this war? Was it to contain the communist threat?
Exactly. The American foreign policy at that time was containment. Contain communism in the countries where it already is, and don't let it spread.
Right.
And when North Korea invaded South Korea and took over almost the entire country,
yes,
the United States intervened. We landed thousands of troops there, and we pushed the North Koreans all the way, not only out of South Korea, but all the way to the border of China in North Korea.
Right.
And that was a turning point, because one day they heard all of these bugles blowing, and tens of thousands of Chinese troops entered the war on the side of North Korea.
Right.
And sometimes, the Korean War is known as the Forgotten War.
Yes.
And sometimes we forget that we were fighting as many Chinese troops, more Chinese troops than North Koreans in the Korean War.
And you gave me a figure of the men who were lost. How many casualties for the Americans?
Well, oftentimes, we go by Vietnam War. We lost 58,000 men over 10 years in Vietnam.
Right, right.
We forget, again, that in Korea, even though it was only 3 years,
yes,
we lost 36,500 soldiers in Korea.
Oh, my word.
It was a terrible war. A lot of it was fought in the wintertime.
Yes.
and it was a bloody war for only 3 years.
Right.
That's a lot of men.
Right. Now, you have a personal connection to this war. Can you tell our viewers that you had relatives who were in this war and what their names were?
Well, I have a number of cousins. One of them was Stephen Dunkirk. He was in the Air Force, stationed in Alaska, which was very important in the Korean War.
Yes.
Another cousin, Tom Romaine, he was in the Navy, so he served on a ship, of course. And the one I think we have a picture of is Harold Dunkirk,
Yes.
Stephen's brother, and he was also in the Navy. And the family story is that he knew he was going to be drafted. So if you join the Navy, you're always guaranteed a soft bed and a hot meal,
Yes.
unlike the Army and the Marines.
Right, right. But none of these men were in Korea itself, were
No.
they?
The two sailors, Harold said that they escorted a lot of transport ships. He was on a cruiser, so they were escorting transport ships of soldiers.
Right, right.
And actually, Tom Romaine ended up being a chauffeur in Washington, D.C. He actually chauffeured the president's wife at one time.
Really?
Yeah.
It's marvelous. Okay. Now, we do have some visuals of actual Korean War records. We have some medical records to show you, and some vet records, and a certificate for someone who was in the Korean War. And tell me, what are the two sites that one can go to obtain military records? You mentioned two sites that are important.
Ancestry.com has a separate database of military records. Also, Family Search has some military records.
Right, right. And there's also one called Fold 3, I believe.
Fold 3 is just military records and is an excellent source.
And that covers all the wars, all
Yes.
of our wars,
Yes.
from the Revolution to the Korean War, or?
I'm not sure about the Revolution, but certainly the modern wars it does cover.
Right. Now, getting back to the Korean War, every town, I know Butler has one, I think your town of Bloomingdale, you have memorials.
Correct.
With lists of men who were in the Korean War. Now, were these men who were killed in action or who had just served?
It's really up to the town. Now, in Bloomingdale, it's kind of interesting because their original Korean War monument just listed names of
Right.
men who were killed.
Right, right.
But just recently, in the last couple of years, they added a new plaque of everyone that served. So now there's a brand new plaque of all of the people from town that served, in addition to the ones that were killed.
And your cousins are on that?
Yes,
on
they
that,
are.
On
Yep.
that plaque. Also, newspapers are a very important source. And you sent me one for a young man named Troy Denike?
Denike.
Denike,
Right.
okay.
And newspapers.com is an excellent,
Yes,
excellent
yes,
source.
we
That's
have
where, that's
yes, we
where I
have
got
to
the-
mention that one. And the obituary, I saw his photo there.
Correct. Oh, it's really, newspapers.com is really excellent for obituaries. And it gave a very excellent record of where he served, how he got killed, and what's unfortunately for that family, he died within hours of the ceasefire.
Oh.
He was one of the last soldiers killed in Korea.
Right,
And then the ceasefire, of course, ended the fighting.
right. Now, I know on your first appearance on my show, I think about maybe almost a year ago, the restoring of old graveyards, which I think you all saw. I hope you all saw it. You have many veterans buried in that cemetery, even a guy from the War of 1812, or two of them, I believe. Do you have any Korean?
We do. We have one. That particular cemetery, the Manning Avenue Cemetery,
Yes, yes.
was started after the Civil War. So we have 25 Civil War veterans. We have 2 War of 1812 veterans, which is unusual.
Yeah.
And we have 2 World War II veterans, one from Korea and one from Vietnam.
Okay.
So yes, we do have one Korean veteran there.
All right. So the Korean War records are available. And as Tom was mentioning, those various sites, Fold 3, Ancestry, and the Family
search.
Families, and you have used all of these.
Yes.
Okay. You know, the 1950s was a colorful era. I remember I was in my boyhood there, and we had Elvis Presley, the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, and there were some dark periods also, which I have to cover. Joseph McCarthy and the Red Scare. Can you go over that with us, please?
Well, unfortunately, Joseph McCarthy was head of the House Committee of Un-American Activities. And similar to what's happening today, he made it his goal to seek out all the communists in Hollywood. And
He picked on Hollywood.
yes,
Okay.
he started with Hollywood, and a lot of famous actors were actually blacklisted.
I think Lucille Ball, but I don't think she was. She joined a club in the 1930s that her grandfather had communist leanings, but I don't.
That's all it took.
Or maybe it was her red hair.
Perhaps.
Maybe it was her red hair that kicked him off or
Yeah.
something. Yeah.
And Charlie Chaplin was blacklisted
Right.
for sure. Fortunately, people like Lucy and Charlie Chaplin were able to overcome it, and
Yes.
it didn't affect them. But hundreds of writers and producers and actors and actresses that actually ended their career having ended their career
Yes.
having that label attached to them.
He ruined many lives and many careers.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. And I had the experience, I met McCarthy's lawyer at a cocktail party. His name was Roy Cohn, okay? And I met him, you know, and I don't like to brag about that too much, but he was McCarthy's lawyer during that time, and he went after people. This was under J. Edgar Hoover, of course.
Correct.
Right. Now, you mentioned these famous people being blacklisted. Are there records available of just regular people who were they were suspected of being communists?
I'm not sure. Mostly when you research it, you find the famous people. You know, as far as regular people, you know, a lot of the names I came across, they seemed like regular people because I didn't recognize them.
Right.
But there are lists of hundreds of people that were blacklisted.
Yeah, I'd like to find out where those, you know, my great uncle the commie was accused of that. So that was a dark period, and I'm glad that you and I were boys in that period because I don't remember it. I wasn't aware of it.
When McCarthy started going after the United States Army and accusing officers and generals
Yes.
as having communist leanings,
Right.
you know, that's more or less what put an end to it. And
I
he was
see.
later disgraced, and you know,
Good.
it was a bad.
Because these
bad
were
time.
horrible witch hunts that
That's
were going
that's
on.
exactly what they were. And he was just looking for headlines.
Right.
You know, he wanted his picture in the paper. And
Right. Now, we do have another source from the 1950s, and thank goodness we have people like Tom Riley, who loves history and pays attention to these long-forgotten periods of that time. And I know you're a big baseball fan, and you played baseball as a younger man, okay? And I want to highlight your book called The Bloomingdale Troopers. The Bloomingdale Troopers. Is that DeLazier?
DeLazier.
DeLazier Field, 1946, 47, and 48. In other words, it was founded in 46. Okay, and it's still, the field is still there.
field is still there.
Or the stadium, you'd call it.
It really is a stadium. you
Right.
know.
Tell us about the Bloomingdale Troopers, and they played until what year?
48 was the last year.
48.
Right. So 46 was the first year. They played 47 and 48.
So this was mid-century.
Yes.
Okay. Did they become something else?
No.
No. Okay. Okay.
Baseball is really a business. And it was unusual for such a small town like Bloomingdale to have a minor league professional team. They were professionals.
Yes. Yes.
In 1947, they were official minor league team of the Cleveland Indians. So that was unusual for such a small town, and it was a stadium that attracted them.
Mm-hmm.
The WPA built a beautiful, as you can see on the cover there, stone stadium.
Yes.
And
Which is still standing.
which is still standing, better than ever, and they could hold about 6,000 people in that stadium. The Troopers averaged about 600 spectators a game.
Right.
And they weren't very good the first 2 years. But the third year, when they were a Cleveland minor league team, they were excellent. You know, they came in second.
Yeah.
But even then, with a really good team, and 4 members of that team over those 3 years, 4 members made it to the major leagues.
Isn't that something?
And-
Now, I'm sorry, go on.
And, you know, Jim Lemon was the most famous player. Not Bob Lemon. He was a pitcher all-star.
Right.
But Jim Lemon in 1960, Mickey Mantle hit 40 home runs for the American League. Roger Maris hit 39 home runs. Jim Lemon hit 38 home runs.
So he's a Bloomingdale hometown.
Bloomingdale was his first team.
Isn't that something? Now, in this book, do you have a list of the players here?
Correct.
So
I have
this is like a genealogical source.
For sure.
If your ancestor was a baseball player.
For sure. And I have had people contacting me asking information because they knew I wrote the book about their ancestors.
Wonderful. And you have some photographs in here of various players. And is it still used as a baseball field now? And
Definitely. You know, it's used for recreation, of course, when the town plays softball. They have men's and women's leagues.
Right.
And the Little League seniors play there. But it's interesting that the Troopers in 1946 said they were going to turn DeLazier Field into a major league stadium.
Right, right.
And unfortunately, it took quite a while. But today, DeLazier Field is a major league stadium. They have sprinklers, they have batting cages. It's an excellent
And you
facility.
played here as a boy.
I grew up a half a block. That's where I wrote
And there's
the book.
photos of you in here.
Of course.
Okay, great.
And I grew up hearing all kinds of rumors about having a professional team and about Babe Ruth playing there. So when I retired, that was my goal, to tell the story of DeLazier Field and the Bloomingdale Troopers. And Babe Ruth really was there. He was not only hitting them over the right field fence, he was hitting them over the houses in right field.
Right, very good. You know, the 1950s, I just want to go over the many things from that era because we lived it. We are living ancestors, right? Young people come up to me and say, "Did you go to Woodstock?" or "Did you drive a Mustang?" No to both questions, unfortunately. But we're from that Leave It to Beaver generation.
Seeing that you mentioned it,
Yeah.
that's one of the things that is interesting about the 1950s because guys came home from World War II
Yeah.
and they had gone through life-threatening, changing situations.
Yes.
And a lot of times they just wanted stability. You know, the 50s is known as a period of stability
Right.
and conservatism. People didn't want change. So interesting the way history works, but what we find is that the next generation, the 60s generation,
Was
that's a reaction
the
to
protest,
the
right.
reaction to the conservatism
Yeah.
of the 50s.
Yeah.
We see in the
I was
liberalism,
a teenager during that period. Right.
liberalism of the 60s.
But I do remember my hula hoop, and TV was in its infancy, and I think we have a photo of me watching television. Now I'm on television. I think I was about 4 years old. We have a photo of that. The girls wore the poodle skirts.
Yep.
And of course, the popular job at that time for a young man was as a soda jerk, as that woman found her grandpa in the census. Yeah. Before we close, if you could tell me very briefly your memory, your boyhood memory of the 50s, very briefly before we close, because this is oral history, what you're hearing right now.
Well, like I said, I grew up a half a block from the baseball stadium.
Yeah.
And one of my first memories is walking down the street with my father. My father had a bad hip. He had arthritis. And I remember distinctly him saying to me that I made a perfect cane
Yeah.
because he could straighten his arm out
Yes.
to the top of my head, and I thought that was just great. That my dad was
And that stays with you.
yes,
Yeah. Yeah.
and other memories of of going with my brother to different fields to
Right.
watch him play ball.
Right. And my memory, which still stays with me after all these years, we all love pizza pie, okay? I mean, there's like 10 pizza joints in one town. But years ago, we did not call it pizza. We called it tomato pie, and it was a delicacy. It was something you only had on a Friday or Saturday night. And in my house, my dad would take me out to a tomato pie kitchen, and I would put the hot pie on my lap. I can still feel that on my lap here. And we'd go home and we'd watch the Friday night fights in black and white, the Friday night fights. My dad would have a beer, I would have Coca-Cola. So that has always stayed with me. And the people who sponsored the Friday night fights was Gillette, and they are still around.
Shavers, right?
Right. So I hope you enjoyed tonight's show on mid-century genealogy. There are many eras. Genealogy spans all historic eras. I once did a show on Victorian genealogy, but now tonight we're doing mid-century. Maybe I'll do 411 BC on our next show. Right. Well, listen, Tom, it was great having you back again, my fellow baby boomer. And thank you all for watching my show tonight on mid-century genealogy. And on that note, as I say all the time, we are all descendants of ancient civilizations. Genealogy is your key to the history of your family. And so until next time, this is Stephen Conte wishing you the very best of luck in your research, and above all, happy ancestor hunting. Good night.